So, as you know, there's a lot of suffering in the world, and there's a lot of hardship in the world. Not only have there been terrible things in the last week in the news that have been happening around the world, but even, in our local community, in our local schools, terrible things have been happening in the last couple of weeks. And everywhere you go in life, you face suffering, right? And you face hardship. But one of the problems is not just that we have suffering in the world, but we struggle to know how to deal with suffering. So, for example, do you remember growing up as a kid, if you saw someone disabled in a wheelchair, you didn't quite know what to do, because if you looked at them, someone would say to you, "Don't stare at them." And so then you spent years of your life, every time you saw someone in a wheelchair, being like, And then you get to a point in your life where, as you're getting older, you start thinking, wait a minute, what's it like for people in wheelchairs when every time someone sees them, they quickly look away like that, as if, "Oh, I didn't see you, I'm not looking at you." And then you're like, well, what can you do about people in wheelchairs? I mean, are you supposed to look at someone? Can you show any kind of empathy with them, or will that be patronizing? Will people be like, "I don't need your charity, thanks very much, nothing wrong with me," Or should we just act as if, that there's not any suffering in your life, and then someone's like, "What do you expect me to do? I'm in a wheelchair." How do we respond to people? It's really hard to know the right way to respond to that. Now, I remember years ago seeing a guy in a wheelchair who really looked like he was trying to cross Roehampton Lane. And he looked like he was really struggling, and he looked like he didn't have much control of his wheelchair. So I'm like, "Don't worry, mate, I'll help you." I push him all the way across the road, making sure that no cars and all that. Get him to the other side, and at the other side, he's like, "Whoa, whoa." He was like, poor guy. And then he just turned around and started trying to make his way back across the road. And I'm like, oh man, I thought I was helping him. I've done totally the wrong thing. And then that means the next time you come across someone who's in some kind of difficulty, you're thinking, "Oh, I better not help out, because, I might do the wrong thing." Same way, when someone's depressed, what do you do about that? I mean, can you say, "Hey, are you okay?" Or is that like, "No, let's just act like no one's depressed and pretend that, Can we try to cheer someone up? Or is it like, "No, they're depressed, don't try and cheer them up. Just, can we help someone to not be depressed? Or is it like, "No, you should never do that. Just let someone be depressed." We have this problem where we don't know what to do with suffering. And in British culture, what we try to do is put suffering as out of the picture as much as possible, right? As much as possible, we put it out of the picture so that we don't have to see and deal with much suffering. And sadly, even in Christianity in Britain, we suffer from this problem of how do we handle suffering? And today, we're going to see in John chapter 9, a story of where Jesus and his disciples were faced with some suffering, and we're going to learn what Jesus had to say about it. And it's John chapter 9. So it's the Gospel of John chapter 9. I've taught on this before when I did a series through John, and I went through it like phrase by phrase, and I think I did anyway. Hope I did. That's not what we're going to do today. It's going to be more like looking at a particular theme and skipping some verses. But I trust that we're going to learn a lot about how we can approach suffering in other people's lives, and also how we can approach suffering and hardships in our own lives. But first, let me pray. Lord Jesus, as we look at your words, as we see about things that you said and did, I pray that we would just sense your presence with us, and that as we look at your words, that we would be learning from you, and that we would be becoming more like you. Holy Spirit, please help me to teach these words accurately in a way that glorifies God. Amen. Okay, so let's go to John chapter 9. Right, so this is 2,000 years ago, yeah? God has become a man, Jesus Christ. He's living on the earth, and he's got his disciples with him. He's going around helping people, right? And John 9 verse 1 says, "As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth." Right, there's a man blind. What's the first thing Jesus does according to that verse there? He saw him. That's the first thing, right? He saw him. Now, don't skip over that yet. I just want you to get that. There's a man who's been born blind from birth, and Jesus saw him. That is significant, right? Because Jesus sees all the suffering that is done to everyone. He sees it all, and he takes it in. It's not like, when you're a kid in the classroom, something bad happens to you, and the teacher turns around and goes, Duncan, I've told you. And you're like, didn't you see what happened? Jesus isn't like that. Jesus is the person who sees all the suffering that goes on. He sees it all. He's not like the media. So, the media's come under criticism lately for how it selectively chooses what events to tell you about. So there'd be terrible suffering happening in certain countries, and the media might not tell you about it. And then there's other countries where something happens and the media suddenly like, hey, this is big news, you've got to know this. And it is big news, but there will be other things happening in other places that we don't find out about. Because when we're watching the news, when we're reading the news and all that, when we're reading social media, we're not seeing everything. We're just seeing a few things. And the problem with that is it means there's loads of people suffering that don't get seen. And sometimes you might feel like your suffering is not being seen by anyone. But Jesus sees it. He sees it, and he deeply cares about it. Which means we don't have to feel misunderstood in our suffering, and we don't have to feel alone in our suffering. We've got Jesus watching us the whole time. So look at verse 2. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So how do his disciples respond to this man born blind? Their first question is, did this bloke sin? Or did his parents sin? So the first thing they're doing is analysing the guy. That's the first thing. They're analysing him. They're looking at the situation and think, how did this happen? They're basically judging him. I'm not necessarily saying it's a harsh judgment, but they're judging him, trying to make judgments. Wait a minute, is it his fault or is it his parents' fault? Whose fault is it? Why did this thing happen? Now, think of the last time someone told you they were ill. Was there any part of you that thought, why are they ill? I wonder, are they eating a healthy diet? Are they getting enough sleep? I wonder why that is. Sometimes we feel this way. Now, if you're in the workplace, and we've all got that person in the workplace, right, who just is always ill, yeah? And like not turning up, you're like, oh, they're not at work again because they're sick. When you hear they're not coming in because they're sick, you find yourself thinking, are they really sick? And you start analysing them and judging them. This is a common thing that we do. When we see suffering somewhere, we can start analysing it and judging it. I know a bloke who was the most healthy eater I've ever met, okay? So this man, we will call him the most healthy eater I have ever met. Even grows his own food, okay? Grows his own food and then cooks it and eats it. Keeps an eye on his sodium levels and everything. He got cancer. Guess what some people said to him? I wonder if maybe it's to do with your diet. So imagine that, you get cancer and people say to you, is it because of your diet? They're basically doing what the disciples do. There's someone suffering. Why did this happen? It's not very practical. It's not very helpful, is it, when you're suffering and then someone's like, why did this happen? So imagine if at the back someone's making the teas and coffees and then suddenly the table collapses. Teas and coffees go everywhere. Imagine if you sat there being like, I wonder why that happened. Did they overload the weight recommended for the table? Is that what happened there? Well, that's not much help to the poor person who's now got like tea and coffee all over the floor. What would be a better response? Go in and help them, innit? Instead of us all being like, wonder why that happened. But this is what the disciples are doing. And if we're honest, we have a lot in common with the disciples. Maybe sometimes you had a situation where someone has been like, look, I'm struggling, I need help. And we find ourselves thinking, do they really need my help? Maybe I need more help than they need. I don't know if they really need my help. Analysing, judging the person. I've actually had people over the years, so I've had this for years, say to me, my bad back is because of sin in my life. I even had one guy, he's like, you seem to be in a lot of pain with your back. I'll pray for you. And I'm like, that is wonderful. And he says, sit down. And he says, there must be sin in your life. I'm like, whoa. And I'm like, there's lots of sin in my life. If you think about it, God tells us to love him with our whole heart. Well, I don't do that every day, all day, so I'm sinning there. And it says to love other people as myself. Well, I love myself much more than everyone else. So I'm sinning there. So yeah, there's lots of sin in my life. That's not necessarily why I've had a bad back for most of my life. But this is how we can tend to be with one another. When we're faced with suffering, we can tend to judge and analyze. And like I said a couple of weeks ago, a guy called Paul Miller, who wrote a book called Love Amongst Us, I think that's the name of the book, he says that judging distances us from suffering. It prevents us from helping people who are suffering. Wouldn't it have been great if the disciples, when they saw this man, had said, hey, come and meet Jesus? I mean, wouldn't that have been good? I mean, you're walking around with Jesus. He's like raising people from the dead, and healing people, all kinds of things. You see a blind man. Wouldn't it be great if they were like, Jesus, can we introduce you to this blind man? Hey, blind man, sorry, we don't know your name yet. Can we introduce you to Jesus? Let's see what's going to happen here. That would have been great, right? And the same way, an application here is, one of the best things we can do when someone's suffering is to introduce them to Jesus. It's one of the best things we can do. And if they already know Jesus, it can be to show them something of Jesus. Help them to cast their eyes upon Jesus. You know that wonderful song, Cast Your Eyes Upon Jesus? Beautiful song. It was either that song or was it the other song, Take It to the Lord in Prayer? The poor bloke had been, he got engaged, and I think his fiancée died, and he got engaged, and his fiancée died, he got engaged, his fiancée died, or something like that. I know, something really tragic, where 3 times he wanted to get married and it didn't work out. And then he wrote this song about going to God, and in the midst of our suffering, going to see Jesus, seeing something of Jesus is a wonderful experience that we can have. So let's read on. Verse 3, John chapter 9, verse 3. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened that the works of God might be, what does it say? Displayed in him, that the works of God might be displayed in him. So there's a third reason that the disciples hadn't thought of. They thought, why is this man born blind? It's either the parents' fault or it's this man's fault, right? And they're probably thinking, it's pretty good. We've come up with two solutions, right? And I don't know if you noticed, but this is how our culture is these days. We come up with 2 solutions to everything. Immigration, what's the solution? Let them in, keep them out. It's like we've got one of two solutions. Yeah. What do we do with countries in dire need? Bomb them, don't bomb them. It's like 2 solutions. What do we do about the welfare state? Take away welfare. Give welfare. It's like, and then there's so many arguments because you're forced into one of 2 solutions. And we do the same thing with suffering. Someone's suffering, we come up with 1 or 2 solutions. It's either this or it's that. And Jesus here comes along and says, there's a third option you haven't thought of. And this is hard for us because we have what I would call a binary system. Anyone know what binary is? Noughts and ones. Computers think in noughts and ones and zeros. Everything's either a 1 or a 0, and it's a whole collection of 1s and 0s that is what computer coding comes from. And we think that way in our culture as well, thinking in terms of it's either a 1 or a 0. And we do this in suffering, when people are facing suffering. And Jesus comes along and says, there's a third way. There's a third way. And this is what it is in this case. Jesus said, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now let's break this down, this third way for why this man experienced suffering. So the first phrase there is, this happened so that the works of God. Well, what are the works of God? Well, it's work that God does. Okay, so you see God's work all the time, right? A sunrise, a sunset, the moon shining above Roehampton at night where it's so big, you just think like you could just climb up on one of the blocks and maybe just touch it, Richmond Park at 2 o'clock in the morning, totally lit up by the moon. I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen that. You're like, what's going on here? It's like daylight. It's just incredible. Those are the works of God. Have you ever been somewhere at the sea where you just see these waves crashing against rocks and you just watch it for a few minutes? You're just like, psh, psh, and you're like, this is incredible. Those are the works of God. All the time, there's these amazing works of God for us to see, right? Going on all the time, right? That's works of God. But here, Jesus is saying, this happened, the man born blind, so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So here, Jesus is saying the works of God would be displayed in this blind man. Not at the beach, not in Richmond Park, not in a beautiful sunset, but in this man who's gone through hardship and suffering in his life. And he uses the word display. You know how some schools have a display case? Have you ever seen that in a school hall? They have a display case, and in it will be photos of people in the school. Maybe there'll be some trophies of some games that the school won, some tournaments and stuff like that. And that is a display case showing the works of the school. Well, Jesus is saying here that this blind man is to be a display case of God's work. Okay, now in those times you might think, who would be a good display case of God's work? Well, you would think of maybe the Caesar, the emperor of Rome, right? One of the great gladiators or something. I mean, today, if I was to say to you, just think off the top of your head, who's someone who you would see displaying God's work? What are some names that might come to mind straight away? I think of someone like Usain Bolt, and I think he's a tremendous athlete, and God made his body that way. God gave Usain Bolt the exact amount of fast twitch fibers that he needs in his muscles to be able to run that fast. You can't physically run that fast without those kind of fast twitch muscle fibers. God did that. That's incredible. I think of Lauryn Hill. You can't sing like that without God. Dude, I remember the first time I heard her sing, I was like, what? Like, how is this possible? And I heard her rap, and I'm like, you can rap like this, and you can. And people have tried since then. I won't mention names, but it's just not the same. And you're like, this is the works of God displayed in their lives. It's incredible. And here, Jesus is saying, this man born blind, he's going to be a display case of God's work so that we can see God's work on show for people to see. It's not what you'd expect, is it? It's not what you'd expect at all. One of the reasons for suffering and hardships in life is so that God's work will be displayed in your life. But here's the thing. There's a really important word I use there, which is one. This is only one of the reasons for suffering. And this is so important because, like I said, we have a binary way of thinking where we say it's either this or that. And I don't want us walking away thinking the Bible just says the only reason for suffering is so that God's work will be displayed. Because actually, the Bible talks so much about suffering, and it gives so many different perspectives on suffering. There's so many different reasons for it. So, for example, in the Bible, one perspective is that there's suffering in the world because of the devil, right? Because of the devil. So we don't want to just say to people, suffering has happened so that God's work will be displayed. We also want to say, well, it has also happened because of the devil. Because he's nasty, he's come to kill and destroy. Now, there's another perspective, which is suffering happened because of Adam sinning in the garden. So we also got to be like, well, that's another perspective. Suffering's also happened because of that. Suffering also happens because of people do nasty things. Hitler did nasty things that caused lots of suffering. Another perspective the Bible gives on suffering is that suffering helps us persevere. It teaches us that in the Bible. But that's not the only thing it teaches us, okay? It also teaches us in the Bible that all things work together for good. So then we've got the idea that suffering and hardships actually ends up being for our good. But it's not the only perspective, because the Bible also teaches that suffering is very sad and it makes Jesus sad. And in one point, you actually see Jesus get angry over suffering in a righteous way, which shows us that another perspective on suffering from the Bible is it's wrong and we should be pretty ticked off about it. Suffering is wrong, which means when someone's suffering, going through hardship, we shouldn't just say to them, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. This is so that God's work will be displayed in life. Because there's also a time for saying to someone, what? That's what you're going through right now? That's terrible. I am so sad for you. I'm praying for you. So there's lots of different perspectives. And it's important that when we come to suffering, we don't just latch on to one of those perspectives. But for today, so that we're not sitting here for 6 hours talking about suffering, we are just going to focus on one aspect of suffering, which is displaying God's work in your life through suffering and hardship. So, how is God's work going to be displayed in this man born blind? We'll go to verse 6, please. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he said to him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Wow. Now, as I said, I've taught on this verse before and explained more in depth what's going on in this story. And there's symbolism about the pool meaning sent, because the idea here is that Jesus is the person who was sent by God the Father, and he's opening the eyes of this blind man. And it also shows us how Jesus opens our spiritual eyes. We're blind, and then he opens our eyes so we see how wonderful he is, and we want to follow him instead of following our own sinful hearts. And so that's what's going on here in this story. But in terms of God's work being displayed in his life, I want to see the first way that we see God's work displayed in the blind man's life. And the first way is that Jesus changes him. Jesus changes him because he was blind, but what can he do now? He can see. This is quite major, right? He was blind that he can see. And suffering is terrible. Suffering is terrible, but do you know that Jesus can change you through suffering? There's a saying, it's a horrible saying, but there's truth in it. There's a saying that you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs. In fact, and it's the same with many things. So like last night, I cooked a Chinese dish for my family that they really like. And when I was doing the egg fried rice, I had to break a couple of eggs. And I hate breaking eggs. I mean, it's yucky, it's gooey. And then, you've got to lift up the bin with a bit of your hand that doesn't have egg yolk on, put the eggs in. Then you've got to try and wash the egg yolk off your hands without getting it on the tap, because you don't want to get salmonella to everyone and all that, It's a yucky business, but you end up with these lovely bits of fried egg in your fried rice. It's really nice. But you had to break those eggs to do that. And the same way, sometimes we have to go through a lot of suffering to experience the change that Jesus can bring about in our life. Yeah, you know what Nicky Gumbel said? Nicky Gumbel's the guy who created the Alpha course. He's a pastor of a church, and he said on Twitter, and so bear in mind, in Twitter, people can only say so much. But in the 140 characters he said this: I have never met a strong person with an easy past. I've never met a strong person with an easy past. This is what Nicky Gumbel says, and he's been around quite a bit. I just found that really interesting. When we go through difficulties in our life, it can make us a stronger person, but only really with Jesus. Because you know that saying, what doesn't kill me will only make me stronger. Yeah. A lot of people say that who are not that strong, but desperately trying to look strong on the outside and are really hurt on the inside. And Jesus can do something different in that he can take us through these difficult experiences, and he can really change us through it in a really good way. And that's basically what he's doing with this man. This man's been born blind. It's been terrible suffering for him. And Jesus changes him, and now suddenly his life has changed. Jesus can change all of us through our suffering. Now let's go to verse 8. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes open, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. So here we see the second way that the works of God are displayed in this man's life. The first way was that Jesus changes him. And the second way is that he now tells others about Jesus, which is really important, right? Because in our culture, we have this thing about when you go through suffering, we have this thing about us being bigged up. So have you noticed, right? I got friends who do this on Facebook. I've been through so much in the last year, so much in my life, but I've come through it a better, stronger person. I know who my real friends are. I know who my fake friends are. I know who my frenemies are. And now I'm better for it. Right. And I'm sure we can all resonate with that, you know, like in certain ways. But the Bible teaches us something different, where this blind man just points people to Jesus. And he's like, Jesus did it. Jesus told me to do this. I did this. And now I can see. Same way, when you've been suffering and going through hardship, people tend to pat you on the back sometimes and say, oh, it's amazing how you've persevered through this. And we can feel like, oh, thank you very much. But actually, what the Bible shows is us saying, it weren't me, it was Jesus. I couldn't have got through this without Jesus. I just couldn't have done it. The problem is sin lies to us and makes us think, no, it was you. You were really good. You persevered. Instead of saying it was God who helped us do it. It was God carrying us the whole way through it. It's a bit like I've heard people describe, you know, Richard Dawkins is the famous atheist who's always saying, you know, God isn't real and all this kind of stuff, when he's not saying that God's really evil and vindictive. But the interesting thing is, what the Bible teaches us is that as Richard Dawkins is saying those things, it's as if God is holding him. The only reason why Richard Dawkins can stand is because God is holding him, and God is allowing him to speak and enabling him to speak the whole time. Richard Dawkins should really be saying, I'm saying all these bad things about God, and the only reason why I can say them is because God is enabling my mouth to move right now. Because it says in Colossians that in Jesus, all things hold together, which means all the muscles in Richard Dawkins' mouth are being held together by Jesus. If Jesus wanted to, he could just say, all right, and Richard Dawkins would just fall apart. So same way, when we persevere through suffering, it's not, yeah, I did it. It's actually Jesus enabling us to go through it. So one of the ways the works of God can be displayed in our life is telling people, it was Jesus. Now, look what then goes on. Verse 12. Where is the man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. And by the way, can I just say that I do think there's a little bit of comedy there. I think this guy's a right character. And I think you'll see later, he's a right character. And there's a reason why John is writing it in this way, letting us know, look at this character. Like, you're like, oh, he's going to tell them all about Jesus. And they're like, where is this man? He's like, I don't know. And then that's it. And then look at the next bit. They brought to the Pharisees, so these are the religious leaders of the day, the man who had been blind. Poor guy, he never gets a name. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. So these guys, they're saying on the Sabbath, you're not allowed to do any work. And they're saying Jesus has clearly done some work because he spat on the mud and he made it. It's like making bricks. It's like he's being a builder for the day. You know, so this is our tendency as humans to take what the Bible says and turn it into much bigger laws than it really is, and to try and make people obey these laws, right? And they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he's a prophet. Okay, he's not an expert on Jesus. He doesn't know that Jesus is the Son of God, but he's still representing Jesus. He's like, he's a prophet. Okay, let's go to verse 24. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I've told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Again, he's being really cheeky here. He knows that these guys do not want to be Jesus's disciples, but he's really being cheeky, right? Maybe this is where the saying cheeky beggar comes from. I don't know. Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. And you would have thought at this point, the man would be put in his place and be really quiet, right? But the man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So again, he doesn't know a lot about Jesus, but he's like, you're saying you don't know where he comes from? Clearly he comes from God, because we've never heard of this before, a man born blind who can see. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Now, you see what they're doing here again? Judging, analyzing, similar to the disciples. Did this man sin or his parents? And they're like, you sinned from birth. You were steeped in sin from birth. That's why you're blind. I think that's what they're saying. So this guy is a right character. Why? Why is he such a character? Why is John writing about this? Why is he putting it in there? I think, this is what I think, right? That what's going on here is we are seeing God's work displayed in this man's life in a unique way. In a unique way. Because if it had been someone else, the story wouldn't have gone like this. There's some characters out there, maybe some of you guys, if you'd been in this situation, you just would have been like, well, I'm sorry, that's all I've got to say about the matter. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it wouldn't have made such a good story, right? God decided that this man who has been born blind would be a man with a certain character about him, a certain sarcasm about him, a certain wit about him, right? And that maybe through his life of being a beggar on the streets, that maybe part of this character developed. Like, there are some people, you got to admit it, there's some people begging in London who have got a certain style about them, right? There's some beggars where you're just like, now that is really good. I like that, you know. And this guy, you get the impression he had a certain style about him, you know. Like, all right, you ain't got any money today, missus. All right, well, maybe tomorrow. I'll be here, same place tomorrow. Who knows? I don't know. But there's something about him that's very likable. And in this case, it works very well with the Pharisees. It's like, that's remarkable. You say you don't know where he comes from? You know, him saying, you want to be his disciples too? Perfect. So what we see here is that God uniquely arranges it, that this man's particular suffering and the way that Jesus works in his suffering brings about a unique result. And that means that any of the suffering that you're going through in your life, any of the hardships you go through in your life is unique to you. And God is going to display his work in your life in a unique way that it can't be displayed in anyone else's life. Because you're all different, a bit like the snowflakes. We know that every snowflake is different, right? That's amazing. Every snowflake is different. And every fingerprint is different. And every person is different. And every situation of suffering is different. I heard a man called Dan Allender said that he talked about his dad dying, and he said whenever someone comes up to you and says, oh, I know how you feel because my dad died, he says something like, really, they should be punched in the face or something like that. I don't think he means that literally, but what he says is suffering is unique to every different person's individual situation, which means we should never say to someone, I know how you feel. Because our experience is never the same as someone else's experience. There's too many factors to know how the pain in someone's life feels compared to how the pain feels in our life. Our suffering is unique, and the way we all respond to suffering and the way Jesus works in our lives is going to be unique. There's plenty of blind people who trust in Jesus who have never been healed of their blindness. But God has displayed his work in their lives in other ways, in other unique ways. Think about Joni Eareckson Tada. You've heard of her, right? When she was still a teenager, she was in the sea and she dived, whatever, into the water, hit a rock, and she's now paralyzed from her, I think it's her neck downwards. So what does she do? She paints. She paints with her mouth, with a paintbrush in her mouth. I can't even paint properly with my hand. And she paints with her teeth. Good paintings. Wow. She's displaying God's work in her life. She hasn't been healed, but she's displaying God's work in a unique way. What else does she do? She speaks at conferences. What else does she do? She travels to other countries where people can't get wheelchairs, and she gives people wheelchairs. What else does she do? She runs holiday camps for people with disabilities and the families of people who are disabled so that they just get a fun time for every summer. Wow, she's displaying God's work in her life. That could only happen through Jesus. That could only happen through Jesus. Jesus is doing something unique in her life. But it's not the same with everyone. So there's other people that it works different ways. So there's that evangelist in Australia who's got no arms or legs. He's born with no arms or legs. How is God's work displayed in his life? Well, he goes swimming. Okay, he goes swimming. He's an evangelist, so he shares the gospel with loads of people in front of big crowds of rooms. There's a lot of personalities who could not do that in front of big crowds of rooms, even with arms and legs. He just does it. And then he also has a business as a motivational speaker. So you see God's work displayed in this life. And then if you think about certain Bible characters, the story of Joseph. Like Joseph, he's put in prison, terrible suffering in his life. And he ends up becoming prime minister. God's work was displayed in a unique way in Joseph's life. But we're not all going to become prime ministers when we experience suffering, right? But that's what happened with Joseph. You think about Job in the Bible. Job one day gets the news that his children have been killed. And what does he do? He goes to God and he worships God. Not worshipping God in the sense of, oh, I'm so happy, I'm thankful, but knowing that God still needs to be worshipped even when bad things happen. That's a unique way that we see the works of God displayed in Job's life through suffering and hardship. I know a guy whose daughter died, and obviously it's a horrific thing to have your daughter die when she's at such a young age. And he started writing a blog about it, and the blog post he put the other day was just talking about the experience of getting the news that his daughter had died, trying to process it, and being like, what do I do now? And he wrote about how when he used to go in army cadets, if they get lost, they go back to the beginning, to where they knew to get their bearings from. And he was like, that's what I had to do. I had to go back to the beginning, had to go back to Jesus. From when he saved me, that first day he saved me, go back to that place. And like, that's so beautiful in a very sad way. And that is a unique way he's displaying God's work in his life, in a unique way that none of us can copy or mimic. It's all unique, the way it works in our lives. And ultimately, we see this with Jesus, right? Jesus had suffering and hardship in such a unique way that was specially crafted for his situation. He grew up in a rough area, Nazareth, and he grew up where his stepdad Joseph died at some point. So he ends up being the oldest brother, taking care of all the family, running the family business, taking care of his siblings. He ended up being falsely accused of various things throughout his life. He had people try and kill him, people try and push him off the cliff at one point. He had to deal with the trauma of that. He was wrongfully arrested. He was betrayed by one of his best friends. And he ended up being brutally tortured and then crucified on the cross. And the whole time, this was all unique suffering for the Son of God so that he would live a righteous life in our place and so that he would take the suffering in our place, like we sung in that song earlier, take the suffering in our place because we deserve to be on the cross and punished for all the sin we've done in our whole lives. And Jesus took that in our place. That suffering was unique to him because only he was a perfect, righteous person who could take that punishment for sin and it pay for someone else. Because if a human tried to take that suffering, they would just be paying for their own sin. But because he was the God-man, fully God and fully human, and he'd never done anything wrong, he uniquely suffered in our place and took our place. So it's at the cross that we see God's best display case of this, of God's work. It's at the cross. If you want to know what's God like in a suffering world, how can I explain God to people who are suffering? If I talk to someone who's been through terrible difficulties in life and they say, well, where was God when I needed him? Or how can he be a good God if he allows bad things to happen? We can show them this display case of Jesus on the cross and say, this is our God. He's a God who enters suffering with us. He enters the suffering with us and he suffers in our place so that we don't have to suffer eternally in hell. We might suffer in this life, but we won't suffer in hell if we trust in Jesus. So he's also the God who shows us in this display case that suffering is never wasted because sin will lie to you. All of us have been born with this force within us called sin, indwelling sin. And it lies to us and it tells you that your suffering is a waste. And it tells you your life has been robbed by this suffering. And it's true. There's a perspective that the devil steals, kills, and destroys. He robs us of things. But the Bible teaches us that the suffering has a unique purpose in our life. We don't always know what it is. The other day, some of you know I have a powered wheelchair that I haven't been able to use yet. And the other day, I'm phoning up someone trying to find out what's happened to my chair, And I'm given the sort of bog standard excuse, and I say, can you chase it up? It's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. It gets chased up, then I'm told, the chair's been available for days. A voicemail was left for you. It's one of those ones you've been checking your voicemail every day and stuff. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, can I have the chair now? Oh no, you have to come in, do some things with the chair, and then we send it to a company who then later will deliver it to you. And I'm like, so anyway, long story, but basically I'm like, what? So I've already waited so many weeks, got the chair, then had to get it repaired, wait other weeks, got to wait more weeks. I'm like, what? This is so discouraging. I so badly wanted to go to bonfire night in my chair. I missed that. Then I thought I can use my powered chair outside before it gets too cold. Now I'm kind of like, I missed that. And I'm kind of down about it. And I'm like, but you know what? God has a purpose in us. I don't know what it is. But this is a hardship that's unique to my situation, and somehow God's work will be displayed in it. And we got to talk to the kids about it and say, there's a purpose in it somehow. We don't know what it is. Sometimes we never know what it is. The book of Job, poor bloke, he never even finds out really what the purpose in his suffering was. So we don't always know. But there's other times in our lives where we do see the purpose, like the time that I've told you so many times about, so I'll be very brief, but when our flat got flooded with sewage years ago. And that was a very testing time. I remember being with the whole family in a car, being like, where do we live right now? That's a difficult thing where you suddenly like, where does my family live? And through that experience, Jesus changed me. He changed me. And then he displayed his work in my life in a certain unique way. And one of the purposes from it was then we ended up being able to buy a house. We ended up being able to buy a bigger place than what we had before, all through our flat getting flooded with sewage. So sin will tell you this is a waste right now. All this suffering in your life, it's a waste. It's robbing your life. But the gospel tells us when Jesus comes into your life, he's going to bring good out of this and he's going to change you. Now, sin will also tell you, because of your difficulty and suffering in life, you can't live a normal life. Have you ever felt that? I just want to live a normal life. I feel that very often. I just want to live a normal life. Well, the truth is, sadly, since the fall, because of what Adam and Eve did, none of us can live a normal life right now. We can't live a normal life. But what we can have is God's work displayed in our lives. We can have that. We can be a display case of God's work. Sin will also tell you, take credit when you persevere through suffering and difficulty. Sin will tell you, take credit for it. You did it. You're a strong person. But let's remember, we only get through it by the grace of God, by Jesus helping us. Let's give him the credit. Sin will also prompt you to judge other people who are suffering and going through difficulties. Sin will prompt you to be like, I don't think their suffering would be so bad if they did this, or that. Sin will try and get us to do that. Let's remember, that's what the disciples did, that's what the Pharisees did, whereas Jesus goes to the man and he provides relief for the man's suffering. So what that means is, instead of judging, we can consider first, can we help someone practically? We see someone going through hardship. Is there a practical way that we can help them? Secondly, we might want to consider, can we show them something of Jesus? Is there an appropriate way I can show this person something of Jesus? If they don't know Jesus, maybe I can share with them how Jesus has helped me. If they do know Jesus, maybe I can pray and think, is there a verse about Jesus that I can share with this person to encourage them? We've got to be careful that we're not trite. Sometimes someone might pour out their heart and say, I'm going through this, it's terrible. And if we just say, well, don't worry, brother, all things work together for good, then we're not entering their suffering with them, which is what Jesus did. He came and entered our suffering, and he suffered alongside us. So the Bible tells us to mourn with those who mourn. So we want to be careful. But there is also a right time and place for saying, I'm mourning with you, and I just want to say I'm standing with you, and I just want to remind you that God will use this for your good, because all things work together for good. Okay, lastly, it's also worth learning from people who've been through suffering and asking them, what have you learned about Jesus through this, so that I can learn from it? Because something I've learned about British culture now, being disabled, is that British culture, by and large, does not really like disabilities. Really doesn't like disabilities. And 60% of disabled people say that Britain isn't a good country to be disabled in, which is shocking, considering that Britain is supposed to be one of the world's, really important countries. Okay, and so here's the thing, right? We tend to see suffering and hardship as a negative thing. Yeah. So, for example, we want to learn. What can we learn from Steve Jobs? He was a very successful man. What can we learn from him? What can we learn from football managers who were really successful? We want them to write books and read their books and stuff like that. But we don't think, let's learn from disabled people. We don't think, let's learn from people who've been through suffering where their life looks like everything has gone wrong in their life. It's funny because one of the missionaries that I've learned so much from is Adoniram Judson. And I find it hard to read about Adoniram Judson because his life was so sad. And I don't really like reading books that make me sad. But I learned so much from it. I'm like, this guy went through so much suffering. But I learned so much from him, which means when we see people go through suffering, we shouldn't only empathize and sympathize and try to help. We can also be like, can you tell me what you're learning about Jesus through this? Because I would love to learn. So that's it, basically. We're all going to face suffering and hardship, all of us, in this life. But Jesus can do a wonderful work through it. He can change us. He can display his work through us. It's going to be unique through all of us. And we can all learn from each other. All of us here go through different suffering in different ways. You don't have to be disabled. There's all kinds of ways. You don't have to be born blind. But we can learn from one another about how we can know more about Jesus through suffering. And as we learn that, we learn more things to then share with one another to help us go through suffering in a Christ-centered way where we become more like Jesus, the Son of God. Let's pray. Oh, Jesus, you are just such a wonderful, merciful, and gracious God. You came to this earth. You entered our suffering. You saw a man born blind from birth, and you healed him. You're so compassionate and gracious. We thank you so much for what a loving God you are. And we thank you for that ultimate suffering you did for us on the cross, dying in our place. We thank you so much. Holy Spirit, give us the grace we need to get through the suffering and hardship that we experience in life. Help us to face it well and to display your works, and help us to help one another to display your works, and help us to learn from one another and to love one another through suffering. Father God, help us to be good children, displaying your works to the world so that you will be glorified. In Jesus' name, amen.